Hello and welcome to the Biz Coach Show, hosted by my Biz Coaches and presented by the TLG Group. On our show, we provide entrepreneurs with the edge they need to succeed. Your hosts this week, as always, are myself, David Macon, and Eric Whitmoyer. Eric, you want to say hi?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Awesome. Hey, today we are talking about something that has been all over the headlines, all over social media, and unless you're living under a rock, you've probably heard about all of the massive tech layoffs that are happening in Q4 of 2022 when we're recording today's show. And just to kind of run through a couple of stats to kind of tee up some of the things we're going to be discussing today, between May and November of 2022, Meta, which of course owns Facebook and a lot of other companies, laid off 11,000 people. Twitter, 3,700. Lyft, 700. Stripe, 1,100. Coinbase, another 1,100. Shopify, 1,000. Netflix, 450. Microsoft, just under 1,000. Snap, over 1,000 people. And Robinhood laid off 31% of their staff. And so when you look at all of these companies and all of these layoffs, begs the question, how did we get here? And so, Eric, I'd be curious your take as we look at all these tech companies, all these massive layoffs that are happening in so many companies that were really kind of household names. How do these companies get in this position, Eric?
Yeah, it's interesting question. We'll start with that. One thing I was going to note, the 3,700 from Twitter, I believe that was a 50% layoff, if I remember correctly.
Massive.
Yeah, it's pretty significant when you look at the overall. There's a little bit more, and I know we're going to go into that a little bit more with Twitter specifically, and obviously the change in leadership there. But generally speaking, I think there's a number of in any scenario like this. It's never one catalyst; it's a series of catalysts. The question is did we not see it coming, and we waited till a certain point to make those changes? What's ironic is that you'll notice all of these happen in the fourth quarter, right? I mean, there may have been some rumblings leading into the fourth quarter, but all of this happened in the fourth quarter, which means, and you're talking, I think there's like 10 different companies on that list, right? How did they all just conveniently all need to lay somebody off at the same time, right? And so the reality is that these likely there was some leading indicators that were, if they were being paid attention to, then there was probably some kind of strategic logic behind waiting till the fourth quarter. What I would suggest is, and I don't want to get into a whole conspiracy theory, but there's a number of different things. One of the things I'll say is in a lot of these cases, many of these tech companies have been allowing, since the COVID scenario, have been allowing people to work from home. And that has become a bit of a rub. So despite how many people kind of adapted to that, and they're like, oh, this is awesome, I love working from home. And many of those same employers are now recognizing that productivity is down 20, 30, 40%. So the point being is that now that the economy has almost officially been decided as a recession, and or at least moving into a recession, now it's politically convenient to lay off a whole bunch of people. It wasn't when it was a remnant of COVID. So I'm not trying to play conspiracy theorist here, but I do think there was some politicking being done when these, otherwise it would have been all 10 of these companies all lay off all these massive numbers of people at the same time. Excuse me. That said, these companies are really, they're technology companies. So they have access to the data. They knew and they saw the trends. So why they waited, that's a tough one to swallow. And it's never, if you're the person that got laid off, I feel for you. The reality is I've been on the ugly side of that scenario a couple times throughout my career, and it never comes at a good time. I mean, it's 4 weeks before Thanksgiving. It's not a great time to get a layoff.
It's a really bad time, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of frustrating because I look at the data, I look at those numbers, I look at those particular companies, and I'm like, there's no way that they didn't know. They were strategically waiting for, and it's almost like they all did it at the same time, so that it was like instead of one person getting blasphemed, they all did at the same time, and then it's like you get off the shelf.
Yeah.
So,
well,
go ahead. No.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point too, right? Because of all of the layoffs that are happening, where's everybody focusing is really on Twitter, mostly because of the grandiose personality of Elon and some of the way that went down. And even before the acquisition was complete, he was talking about laying people off. And so I think that, to your point, is distracted from a lot of these other companies. And definitely the timing is interesting. So whether it's politics, optics, whatever it might be, definitely something was going on there, and thinking strategically about how it would be seen, and maybe not thinking strategically enough in the business leading up to it. So totally
Yeah.
agree.
And like I
Yeah.
said, I think a lot of it really kind of carries over from the COVID phenomenon, in the sense that we knew the productivity's been down. I mean, the companies I consult with, they have employees. They've had to get all their employees back in the offices. Most of my companies are small companies, 20, 30, 50 employees. So there are some jobs that can work from home, right? There are certainly some tech jobs that can be done from home. However, when this happened, most people were not trained on how to work from home effectively.
Right.
I consult a client today, and I play an active role within the organization. And one of my biggest frustrations is every time we have a conference call together, a video conference call together, at least 3 or 4 people on the call are working from home, obviously.
Yeah.
And I work from home all the time, but I have a designated office, right? I have sound
Yeah.
buffering material, and I have a door, and I I lock it from the outside. It's like I do everything I can to ensure that I have a good work environment. I've got dogs barking in the background. I get kids screaming. I got people having conversations that everything can hear, and I'm like,
Yeah.
there is no way that you're being productive day in and day out working from home if that's the environment you live in or work.
Yeah.
And
No,
go
you're
ahead.
Yeah, you're totally right. No, similarly, right? I've generally worked remote or from home over the better part of a decade, and that work style definitely was different than how people work from home during COVID, and I think that it's a really big difference in how work was approached, and I stick to, at least for me, and I know it's not for everybody. Working from home, I'm probably 30% more productive because I don't have all the office distractions. But for a lot of people, they're at least 30% less productive because there's more distractions, or they don't have the right setup, and they're not great at managing their time. And so I do think that for a lot of these companies, you can't make these overarching policies where everybody works from home or nobody works from home, and there's certainly roles and people that excel in both areas. And I think it's important to look at that, and certainly I do think it's a factor in these layoffs, like you
Yeah,
said.
yeah, and I think that if you look at a lot of the reports where the productivity was down, if you can't, the problem is if you look at the big companies and you look at the earnings per share and what the quarterly returns were and all that kind of stuff, that all gets masked. But if you look at
Yeah.
individual productivity by person, and you talk to anybody who's in middle management today, over the last 3 years, productivity is down dramatically. And it's because people
Yeah.
are allowed to work from home and they're not educated or trained on how to effectively do that. And so,
Yeah.
one of the first things that I coach my clients on, I'm like, if there's not a good reason for the client to work for an employee to work from home, I encourage them not to do that, because I don't
Yeah.
see how it's effective. It takes from culture. Well, let me rephrase that. If the organization was built that way and really sustained and reinforced the concept of their culture and what their culture was going to be and how it was going to be, and they educated and trained people on how to sustain and maintain throughout leadership, how to sustain and maintain culture and work expectations and things like that, then that would be different. But we had to make a knee-jerk reaction because of the circumstances, and nobody was prepared for that. And
Yeah.
consequently, in the retrospect, we've got these huge productivity numbers down, and then you've got the economy kind of bailing out, and so you got everything kind of coming together all at once. And so this confluence has really forced everybody to make these massive layoff decisions.
Yeah. No, and it's a good point too, because most managers, unless they've been specifically trained on how to manage remote workers, it's a different skill set. And if they're not equipped for it, like I said, productivity is going to drop and a number of other issues. So I totally agree. And I think that one of the issues is, a lot of companies were really slow to bring people back into the office because they were worried they were going to lose people. And now look at where those companies are. We were afraid to lose people, so we didn't make the tough decision. And now we had to lay off, 1,000 people because the business is hurting. And so it's one of those things that, man, if we'd acted earlier and maybe we only would have lost, 400 people and the rest would have got a lot more productive. So it's one of those tough decisions that you have to look at.
Agreed. And you look at Meta, theirs is a little bit different because their productivity is down for a number of different reasons, not just productivity like by employee, but also there's some strategic moves that they made that have not been paying off anticipated. But there's more to that big number. But the other thing I was going to mention, as you're talking about managers being trained to manage somebody remotely, right? That's a whole other skill set. Matter of fact, if I would venture to say, I've probably seen a dozen books and audiobooks and stuff like that have been done in the last 2 years on how to manage a team remotely because it's become so much of a focus, right? And at the end of the day, it doesn't really change dramatically how you manage your people, but it does change the way that, what kind of metrics your expectations are set on. Do you have the resources to manage those? I mean, that's a whole other thing. I saw a lot of people make a lot of investment in not just Zoom, but software programs that would actually manage your time online. Making sure that you're logged in when you're supposed to be and doing what you need to be doing and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting, kind of going back to the Twitter point that we were talking about. It's been unique in that Elon purchasing Twitter has been airing a lot of dirty laundry that a lot of times we wouldn't get the insight into. And, you see all of these, kind of bloat, I'll say, within Twitter that existed from, catered lunches where nobody showed up and all sorts of other craziness that's all over the social media sites and news. But I think it's also important, and I think for people listening to this, to think about, even in the best run business, it can always be leaner, right? Yes. And it's a couple of years back, there was this, Kaizen movement and, Six Sigma has been around forever, but there's always an opportunity to improve efficiency, to do things, faster, better, less expensively. And I think that for a lot of people, they get comfortable with, hey, things seem to be going pretty good, we're profitable, but I think it's always important to keep that kind of scrappy mentality. And especially if your business is small, you have to do that to survive. But I think you have to keep that mentality of, where can we make things leaner without, diminishing our employee experience or the customer experience. And I think we always have to have that mindset. I think that's important. Yeah.
And I would go so far as to say, and you're a little more sensitive to this than I am, but the whole Gen X, Gen Z, the millennial generation, there's a lot of discussion about what they want in a work environment. Like I know we, quite a few years ago now, we were in Boise when we took over a market in Boise, and they took us into their call center. Yes. And we walked in, and it was like a day, not a daycare. That's a bad example. Sorry, like an amusement park.
Yeah, it's like a Dave and Buster's.
Yeah, Dave and Buster's, exactly. Yeah, it's like I don't think they had a bowling alley, but I know they had like pool tables and air hockey and all kinds of stuff. And I totally get it, right? You're within the environment. They only get a 30-minute break. They don't really get a chance to get out. But there's a lot to be said about what people are looking for from a work environment and from a feeling comfortable. And so, but at the same time, right, you have to realize what return are you actually getting for that investment. And I think that here's the thing. There's a lot of companies that get a lot of really great pub for running a phenomenal organization, good leadership, great culture, and they get people and they get buy-in and they get people to do what they need to do and work above and beyond and do all those things. And they have those types of environments. And then what happens is somebody else who's a little less developed, a little less competent in the ways to manage their people, they're still developing and learning, but they see this other company being chronicled and put up on a pedestal about how great they are and they got this great culture and everybody loves working there. So they think, oh, that's what we need to do. And they go and spend all this money on that, but then it's executed poorly. Right. Yeah. And then consequently, like you were referencing at Twitter, you get a catered lunch and nobody shows up for it and you waste $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 or whatever it is. It's pretty ridiculous when you think about it. And you take your average small business and you're like, I'm forking over, I don't know, $150 for pizza and wings and some soda and, to come in to pay for my team to have lunch or something like that. I think there's also and as I mentioned, the millennial and Gen Z. It's the idea we don't want to do it the way our parents used to do it.
Yeah.
So there's this. We've got to do it different, and I think that every generation goes through that. Like we have to do it different than our. I know I did that. I looked at the way my dad ran his business and what he did, and I'm like, I'm going to do it different than that.
Yeah.
And then this younger generation, they're coming into their own, and they're like, I'm in a leadership role now. I'm going to do it different than the way my parents did it, or whomever that they measure against. And I think that plays into it too, because what happens is we don't necessarily always know. We don't always take enough time to understand exactly what it is that's getting the results, that's getting the buy-in and creating that culture, the organizational culture, and that's a piece that we don't do enough of asking the right questions to understand. Sometimes we just go off of what somebody, it was a great thing on TV. I saw this on social media or something like that, and that's awesome. That's how we have to do it. And I'm like, that's not how it works.
No. Well, and to your point, sometimes those practices are effective because it works within that company's culture. When you take it outside and put it in another company's culture, it doesn't work. And so that's a factor. I think a lot of times we do things that are trendy, like you're saying, instead of doing what's backed by science, what's backed by data. And that's when we're providing, recommendations for our clients. They're data-backed solutions, there's science, there's, neuroscience behind how people learn, right? There's things that we know work and we have the data to support it. Everything else kind of is a fad. And a funny example of that I saw recently was, for better part of a decade, this move to open offices. That's the modern workplace. Right. It's the greatest thing ever. You look at all the data coming out of it saying it was actually the worst thing we've ever done because it dropped productivity. People hated it. There was no private, so many issues with it. And it's one of those things that, a couple of big Fortune 500 companies did it and they thought it was revolutionary and, it's so modern. It's so cool. And then you find out it's actually not effective at all and is actually less productive than a traditional work environment. So it's just, kind of underscores the point of these big companies doing things that are trendy, not doing things that increase productivity in the bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. And then that's where I think and then that's honestly, I hate to be harsh, but it's poor leadership. Somebody gets an idea and they run with it, but nobody takes the time to quantify it. And by not quantifying it, you're actually, just making a guess. And when you do that, then, at least, if you're going to try something different. But take the time to quantify it and find out if there's value in it. The problem is once somebody makes the recommendation, now they're attached to it emotionally, and they can't afford. They don't want to be wrong, right? Yeah. And so they're like, I can't afford to be wrong, so it's got to work, right? And then that's not productive either. That's counterproductive.
Especially when you're the bleeding edge tech company that, is making headlines every day. You can't suddenly, reverse course and be like, oh, that was stupid. Yeah, that was a really bad idea. Yeah, don't do that, guys. That it loses all of your credibility, Absolutely. Right? So totally.
And to take it one step further on the Twitter thing, and I think that's, as we're talking about leadership, I think it's another interesting concept. Obviously, Elon is unique. Yes. I've got people that I look up to. Elon is actually one of them. Maybe not necessarily for his leadership, but certainly for his knowledge, understanding, his ability to grasp technology and different concepts, and just very impressive. But his style isn't substantially different than Steve Jobs. When Steve Jobs was in his 20s when he first started Apple, right? When he and Wozniak started Apple back in the 70s, Steve Jobs was in his 20s and he was a raging lunatic as a leader. Made poor decisions, half rear-ended. They were off the cuff, mostly emotional. And in the grand scheme of things, he was just trying to get people to do the most that they could do, right? Trying to get the most out of them. That was his big thing that he always really kind of hung his hat on, which was, I get the most out of people. And he did, but he also burned a lot of people in the process. Yeah. Right. And my point is Elon's done a lot of that, did a lot of that at Tesla and ran off a lot of high-ranking engineers at the company. I think they went through 3 CFOs at one point over a 4-year span of time or something. And a lot of that comes from the people element of the business. Elon's super, super intelligent, is not always very relatable. I see him in a lot of podcasts. I've seen him with Joe Rogan, and he's well spoken. I mean, he knows he's relevant. It's not like he's so far removed. It's just, I think sometimes he thinks in a way that other people can't grasp. And so he loses them and gets impatient. And then, that's where the development and leadership, and I'm not saying he needs to develop, well, yeah, he probably does. But what I am saying is, I guess how this relates to a small business owner, surround yourself with people who can help buffer those relationships, right? Because that's the big opportunity is if you realize that you've got a good plan, you've got a good model, put in the right leadership to manage the pieces that you're not good at. As a matter of fact, years ago, I took my leadership group through strengths-based leadership. Yeah.
Yep.
And it was all about leveraging and, first of all, understanding what your strengths were, what your weaknesses were, and then allowing you, when you build out your team, to find people that fill in your weaknesses, right? So that their strengths are your weaknesses and vice versa, because then that helps you have a more well-rounded team. I think that, in my opinion, my humble opinion, Elon would benefit from that. And I don't think that he hasn't done that, but I think that every time you see him go in and make drastic changes like he did at Twitter, he's just trying to break the culture. I mean, I've had to do that before. You go into a company and you're trying to do a massive turnaround, you got to jolt them. And definitely what he did was a jolt for sure. And some of the comments he's made have been jolts from what their previous culture was. But you have to do that. And I know a lot of other people, you get a lot of backlash about that. But there's some sense of that obviously makes sense. And he's got to kind of get people to recognize, hey, we're going to need to make some major changes or this company's not going to last. So
yeah, and I think it's a great perspective to have. Kind of two parts. So the first thing that resonated with what you just said was when you have that change in leadership, that new leader, there's an expectation they're going to make some tough decisions, right? And oftentimes there's decisions previous leadership should have made, and maybe they were afraid or just not how they did business. And so I think that's important for entrepreneurs. Maybe you're buying an existing business, or you see an opportunity to acquire a competitor. You're going to have to go in there, and you may have to be the bad guy and make some tough decisions, but that's the right decision to make, and we can't be afraid to do that. So I think for entrepreneurs listening, that's a really important thing. Maybe don't broadcast it on Twitter, and maybe do a little more privately,
right,
maybe a little more sensitively in some aspects, but at the end of the day, right, they're decisions that needed to be made for the good of the business. So I think that's a good point. I think the other thing too is I see a lot of times, like stories of how billionaires, their daily routine, right? So it's, structure your day like Elon, structure your day like Buffett, right? What whoever you look up to. That's not really, I don't think, good advice, right? And I think for a business owner to look and think, well, I'm going to lead my business the way that Elon does, I think that's the wrong advice. I think doing something like StrengthsFinder, like you talked about, I think it's much more effective for leaders to better understand themselves, to understand their team, their business, than it is to try to emulate somebody that you see, on your social media feed every single day. And so I would say, it's important to look at what's happening in these other businesses and think about, why did it happen? Why are these decisions being made? Why did these layoffs occur? And to learn from that, but not to go to such an extreme to say, okay, I need to handle similar issues in my business the way this, famous leader did. I think that's the wrong approach. I think you have to individualize it, and you have to make it unique to your business.
Agreed, absolutely. And sometimes that comes with, we've mentioned this before on this channel, and we'll continue to. Small business owners are on that island, right? It's the biggest challenge that you have as a small business owner is you don't have a board of directors to go to. You don't have a CFO, a COO, a CRO, whatever it is, as a close confidant that you can go to and say, hey, we need to do this with the organization. What do we need to do here? You bring in your HR director and say, we need to improve culture, get more buy-in. What are some of the recommendations you have? You don't have those resources as a small business owner. It's all you. So, and it's super important to try and find those other perspectives. But like we were talking about, like you mentioned and I mentioned earlier, you also have to quantify those, those thoughts, and even try and vet out the unintended consequences. Because you roll something out that doesn't actually have the result that you were looking for, it actually has a worse effect, right? And you have to kind of look ahead as much as you can and try and figure that out. That's where other points of view are really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree. And I think whether it's, as we've talked about today, whether it's getting better, wise counsel to help you through it, or looking at the data, I think the main thing that I'm seeing with a lot of these businesses is awareness and detachment. So maybe we talk just a minute about that. Is how do businesses kind of take a step back, or business owners, entrepreneurs that are listening to this, how do you detach from your business and look at, the data? How do you look at things objectively? One of the things that I talk about a lot is looking for ripples before waves. And I think oftentimes we wait until these big waves are crashing against us to make a course correction, when we could have done it when we saw these smaller ripples. So I'd be curious your thoughts, Eric, on how can business owners really detach, get that needed clarity and perspective on their business, and any advice that you have for somebody listening that's maybe trying to avoid one of these massive layoffs by making some course corrections today.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Get a coach. Yeah. I don't mean to be that. Yeah. It's you need another perspective, and you need somebody who's unbiased. Like what I've recognized, a lot of my clients that are smaller business owners, their biggest confidant, or their most reliable confidant, is often their spouse.
Yeah.
And the spouse is either never was or hasn't been actively involved in the business since the early days when the startup. And now here it is 10, 12, 15, 20 years later, they're so far removed from the day to day. But that's who they're going to, because that's who you share your frustrations with, right? You share it with your spouse, maybe a parent, or a friend, depending on where you're at. And are those people qualified to give you any advice? That's the biggest piece that I see. I have a couple of clients that they're going through some unique circumstances, and the economy is not helping. So it's helping. It's kind of forcing the hand on some to make some moves. And they sit down with me. We meet once a week, and they sit down with me, and they're like, "Yeah, so this guy that I know that does this told me I should do this, and this other person told me this, and my wife's friend I should do this." And I'm like, those are all great perspectives and valuable to consider. But at the end of the day, what do they know about your business?
Right.
Right. And that's the thing, I think that a lot of people get caught up in, is they get these ideas, suggestions, and you referenced earlier about, looking at social media, reading articles, whatever it might be. You get an idea and you're like, oh, that's what I should do because that's the situation I'm in. That may or may not be the case. And the only way you really is to be completely clear with who you are, what you're good at. Like you said, getting to know yourself, your team,
Yep.
your business, and really understand your business. Ironically, I just came from a real estate conference, as I mentioned, as we're getting on the call, and the guy was talking about knowing your numbers. I'm like, that's the first thing I talk about with my business owners is what are your numbers? If you know your numbers, you're going to see the writing on the wall when things start pivoting, and you're going to see it in days and weeks rather than months. And you won't find yourself running up against the wall where you're like, oh my God, now I got to make this big knee-jerk reaction. But oftentimes, if you had somebody who was a more objective observer, because that's the problem you're mentioning, right? What you're mentioning. Yep. I look at the data and I'm like, okay, now I got to make a tough decision. Do I let Susie go?
Right.
Right. And that's the problem, is that now it's Susie. It's not the woman who works at the front desk. It's Susie, who happens to be a single mom, and she's making ends meet on $18 an hour or whatever it is. I'm not saying not be human, but you have to look at the business objectively, and then you determine, okay, based on what you've decided, how you want to run your organization, what's important to you. That you don't want to lose good people, and Susie's a great employee and she works really hard. So you're going to figure out something to do. But that's probably the first person you're going to have to let go, because that's the one that has the least amount of influence in the overall productivity of the business.
Yeah.
Right. But that's where the tough part is sometimes you have to hear that from somebody else who can be objective, because as a business owner, if you're running the day-to-day operations, which I try to encourage all my owners to put in leadership that is experienced leadership when they can. Obviously, that only makes sense when you get to a certain size and scale. But the point is that you've got to be able to make those tough decisions. And if you can't, then you need somebody to help balance those ideas off of.
Yeah. And Eric, I'll ask you this. I think I know the answer, but just to highlight what you're talking about here, how often have you met with a client and made a recommendation, and their response is, "Oh, we can't do that," to which you respond with something like, "Why not?" Has that ever happened in your conversations?
You know darn well.
Uh,
I won't say it's a common occurrence, but particularly with newer clients, that is almost always a given.
Yeah, and the reason I ask, and thanks for humoring me,
Yeah.
is I think that it's important to note that you know we get just stuck in a rut, right? Even if our business is successful, it's growing, all of that, but we can still be in a rut in our thinking. And I think that's really where bringing that coach in is to come in and offer that objective perspective, and get the owner thinking about, well, shoot, yeah, maybe I can do that. Maybe I, could let that person go, or maybe we could offer this other product, or maybe we could expand our marketing, right? Whatever that is, we put these, limits on our business or our own thinking that an objective person can come in and really help with. And sometimes I'll joke and say, hey, I've got an unfair advantage as a consultant because I come in with a totally fresh perspective, and you're in it every single day. And so sometimes I come in and they're like, man, you're a genius. How'd you even think of that? And I'm just like, how did you not think of that?
Right.
But it's because they're in it, right? When I come in and I come in with, a different experience, different background, maybe even a little unfamiliar with their industry, I ask questions, and I'm interested, and I'm learning, and I maybe think about things differently than they might. And so that's where bringing in a coach, a consultant, can really help. And I do think it's probably the best way to detach and really get the perspective you need.
Yeah, and I think, quite honestly, I mean, unless you're in a situation, depending on the size of your organization, if you've got a handful of employees that are your core leadership group, or maybe it's the group that you started the company with, and now you've grown in size. Maybe you had 2 or 3 core people that started the business with you, and now you're 10 or 12 people. Those 2 or 3 people that grew the business, that started it from day one with you, they know you, right?
Yeah.
They know your strengths and weaknesses. They are familiar with where you're going to struggle, and quite honestly, they're gonna be the ones that are gonna call BS on you when they hear it or see it.
Yeah.
And that's not always ideal, because that can be a problem too, particularly if one of those individuals actually becomes a challenge. But generally speaking, the reality is when there's tough decisions to make, you need somebody who's familiar enough with the business to give you insight on different people that you may not have seen. Right? That's another thing. I used to rely on you extensively in the training role, in regards to what your take is on an employee that I might not be terribly excited about currently. Right? And
I recall those conversations.
yeah, exactly. Well, and I'd say, hey, I'm not getting the best results from this individual, and then you tell me how great they were in training, or or maybe they weren't. They were disruptive and weren't really valuable, and actually, But the point is, I could rely on that because I knew that you knew me. And if you shared with me, well, you know what, you might not be seeing this from his perspective because this is how he is. I'm like, oh, okay, that's a fresh set of eyes, a fresh perspective. I can actually take that information, go back and reevaluate how I'm addressing that individual. And many times that was what it took to kind of turn the corner with that individual.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's interesting. As you were talking, I had to quickly look up a book title because it reminded me of something that you said. But when you were talking about the people that help you launch the business may not be the best people to carry that torch forward. It reminded me of, I know we both love reading, and it's a book called Who. It's all about hiring A players is kind of the terminology of it. But a very similar concept of when you're bringing new people into the organization, and I'd say extend it to evaluating existing people in the organization, is they might be the right people, but it may not be the right time in your business for that person. And so maybe if you're in a rapid growth chapter of your business, you need somebody who's experienced in that versus somebody who is a really good tactical operator. They know how to get out there and meet with clients, but maybe not so great at the marketing side. And so I think that's a really interesting perspective, and I'm sure we could spend a whole show talking about that. But I think it's a great question, is really taking a step back. And that's where bringing in somebody like Eric or myself to say, hey, let me help evaluate the people on your team and determine if they have the skill set needed, not only for today, but for the next chapter of your business. Is super valuable because, like you said, we see them as Susie or Bobby or Fred or Juan, right? But at the end of the day, we can take a more objective perspective and say, hey, I know you love them, I know you care about them, but they're not the right skill set we need for what we need to do. So, yeah, I just reiterate what you're saying and give our listeners a book to check out.
As you mentioned that, I'll give you a great example. I went into a law firm out in LA. I was called in to help them assess who was going to be the right person to take over as the office manager, and at the same time give them some perspective on some of the people they were a little frustrated with, as well as help with some efficiencies and stuff like that. And generally, I'm more of the sales guy, the sales and marketing guy, but I've got my fair share of efficiency. And we went in. I spent a week, interviewed a total of 19 employees over the course of the week. And, some of the takeaways that I had were, I'm like, did you know that this individual not only has their MBA, but also has 10 years of experience in this category, and they could actually be probably one of your better candidates for moving into a leadership role. They're going to need some coaching and developing because they've never worked in a law firm, but they want to go to school to get their law degree. So, as they went but they didn't even know that about that particular candidate.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And you're not going to know. You got 20 employees. You're not going to know everything about every employee, right? But and that's part of that is how do you have a structured, and you know more about this than I do, but how do you have a structured follow-up program with your employees when you do your quarterly or annual reviews? What does that look like? What does that process look like? What kind of questions are you asking? What kind of conversations are you having? Are you talking about their goals, right? And this particular individual is slow to put what I would have called like an operations manager or maybe a COO or something like that. They've got a big organization. They're doing $4 million a year. They can afford a good quality leader to manage the day-to-day operations because they're super great at being a lawyer.
Yeah.
Not so good at running the day-to-day business.
Right.
And don't want to. Right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Right. So anyway, but they were blown away by within just a week. I could know everything, but not everything, but the vast majority of everything that made this office run, and how it could help them recognize the key people within their organization that are really going to make a difference.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's just 10,000 interviews and how many thousands and thousands of employees I managed over the years. You just learn to pick up on those things.
Yep. Well, and to bring it full circle back to our conversation about the mass layoffs is you got to think somewhere along the way they had the wrong leader in the wrong role to get in the position that we're in. And, certainly the economy has a role to play and a number of other factors. But when you look at, what was within their control and how we could have minimized what ended up being, a really catastrophic thing for a lot of people, which then has ripple effects to the economy, right? Because now there's a lot of people with high paying salaries that are no longer employed and are looking for work, which for those people who might be listening, may be a great time to start a business. We'll talk more about that in later episodes. But I think, a lot of that could have been avoided or minimized with the right leader in the right role. And so for an entrepreneur, those people decisions are really important. And I'd say even, the smaller you are, the more important they are because they're the kind of people that are going to help you scale and move that business forward. So, appreciate it, Eric.
Yep, absolutely.
So, well, any other final thoughts on the layoffs or anything else you want to add today?
Well, I'm glad you asked. There's, I literally, how my affliction with Tony Robbins, and
yes.
I actually was TikToking of all things, and he came up and he was doing a little thing on. I couldn't tell you how dated it was, but he definitely looked younger than he is now.
Yes.
So I'm gonna go back to 2008.
Okay.
2008-9 during that economic bubble. He made a comment. It was recorded. He was live doing a conversation with somebody. But he basically said, it's like, hey, the politicians are telling you they're going to bring all the jobs back. And, but these are not, what do I call them? Not high tech jobs or not, they don't require strategic thinking, right? These are the more labor jobs. And what he was saying is those jobs aren't coming back.
Yeah.
They're being automated.
Right.
AI is going to replace those jobs, whether it's robotics or AI. Well, it was robotics back then, it's AI now. But that's going to continue to evolve. That's not going away. If anything, it's going to get more accelerated.
Yeah.
Right. And each time we go through economic downturns, to your point earlier, companies need to get leaner.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't care if you've got 10,000 employees or you got 10 employees. Every time something goes bad in the economy and you have to adjust, it's going to require you to get leaner. It doesn't necessarily mean people lean. It just means you got to get leaner.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't need as big an office space. Maybe you don't need all the equipment that you're using. I have clients that still use copiers. I'm like, why do you have a copier when you have a scanner? It's like, and sometimes it takes a fresh perspective, like you said.
Yeah.
But when he said that, it really resonated with me because I've watched that happen at least 4 times in my lifespan. And I go back to the early 80s.
Which is considerable.
Yeah. Thank you, David. I appreciate that. But you go back to the early 80s, it was the car manufacturers, the auto manufacturers. And there were massive layoffs and shutdowns. And then in the 90s, it was steel mill factories. And I lived back east, so I was very familiar with the steel mill factories, shutdowns, and the layoffs. And then you move into the 2000s, you got the technology enhancements, right? You get the dot-com bubble and things like that, where there's a lot of pivots there. But and then we have the series of you got 2001. We had the conflict in the Middle East. Started with that 9/11, right? We had a big economic bubble from that. Then we went. It was like 2007. There was another one. Then there was 2006. I think it was. There was a little bit of a, and then it was 2008-9. And then it was a huge one. Right? Well, that carried what for 8-9 was like a 3-4 year span, right?
Oh yeah.
And then we got COVID, and then we got it again. So that's 4 or 5 major things that happened in the last 35, 40 years, whatever it's been. And during that span, each time companies are forced to get leaner. They're forced to get more, get better understanding of their business and what makes their business run, and understand how to pivot. Look at new technology and recognize how that can improve productivity in their business. And if you're not constantly doing that, and I say constantly, I go back to good to great.
Yeah.
Stay true to your core, but always look to innovate.
Yeah.
Right? Stay true to your core, but always look to innovate. And if you're not constantly looking to innovate, you're going to get hammered when these times happen.
Yeah.
Right? And so my point being is that, you're talking about people getting laid off. If you know how to manage people and you know how to strategically think, you're always going to be able to find a good job.
Right.
May take a little bit longer because the more money you make, you've heard all the studies, right? I'm sure you know them better than I do. But it takes a lot longer to find those good jobs.
Oh yeah.
But when you think about all these people getting laid off and you think about how many of those jobs are replaceable with AI, you got to realize that none of those jobs are coming back.
Yeah.
I would go so far as to say, I'm looking at those numbers again, it's 15-ish, maybe 20,000 jobs, depending on what the Robinhood number is. So let's just say it's 20,000 jobs. There's 10,000 jobs that aren't ever coming back.
Yeah.
They're going to be replaced by AI, guaranteed.
Yep.
Right? So if you're in that mix, right, and improve your skills. So come full circle, what Anthony said was improve your skill set.
Yeah.
Right? And understand technology, understand how to adapt and embrace technology. Because I can tell you, growing up, I watched the auto manufacturers, the people picketing out in front of the auto manufacturers. Right? I remember the people picketing out in front of the union workers, picketing out in front of the steel mill factories. And then rather than going to school and getting educated and using the resources available, people just they tried to fight it. And my thing is, you got to adapt.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say to people. And then to your point, when I say adapt, it's either improve your skill set and recognize where you can actually improve and be even more valuable to the company, or go start your own company, which is what I did.
Yeah. Which I would imagine a lot of people listening did as well, right? Or some form or fashion of it. But no, it's interesting you say that, Eric, in the field that I work in around, learning and talent and performance. I mean, there's new technology. I literally try out, I'd say 4, maybe 5 new pieces of technology every month, whether it's a new coaching platform or, a demo of a new learning management system or, some augmented reality, training tool. And it's important, right, for me because everything is getting increasingly digital. But I think even if you go outside in even the furthest industry from what I do, technology is playing a role, and it's going to play an increasing role. And if you're running a business today and you're not constantly trying or finding a new point of sale system or new marketing software or new automation software, you're missing out because your competitors are. And you have to take that stance of there is something better out there than what I have today. And I've even seen clients that went out and there wasn't a software on the market. So what they did is they hired a company to build a software that they turned around and sold to other people in their same industry, and it became a whole new business model. And they saw, hey, this isn't working. Let's do something better. And now they shifted all of their time and effort to the software that they sell to everybody else. And so I think that, considering the influence, the impact of technology, where you can go with it and always thinking, hey, it can be better, it can be leaner is critical. So couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I got 2 quick stories to share relating to what you just said. First one is I started the trucking business in 2018, right? Actually, it was the end of 2017, beginning of 2018. I go out there and so that I don't fall on my face, I go out and I ask a lot of questions of other people who are already operating.
Yep.
So I go to this one gentleman. He was running a company. I want to say they got 120 trucks or so. And I asked him about the technology they use to track their trucks and their trailers. So, and generally speaking, if you have a tractor trailer, you typically have 2 or even 3 trailers for every tractor you have. So, you get 100 trucks, you've got like probably 500 units you need to track because you got a tracker for the trailer, and you got a tracker for the truck, yeah, and then you're tracking your drivers,
right?
And so they were paying when I started talking to him. This is 2018. They had just 2 years earlier invested $7,500 per truck.
Wow.
To implement this software, this computer unit that was, stuck in the truck and everything like that. And I looked at that and I'm like, well, how am I going to compete with that? Buy the truck is going to cost me $80,000 to $100,000, and then I'm going to spend another $7,500 in the equipment. This software is using.
Yeah.
The trailers weren't as expensive, but the tractors themselves, it was a $7,500 unit. And I started, of course, with our background in technology and wireless. I'm like, there's got to be a better way.
Yeah.
It's like. And literally, all we did was go out and buy $100 tablets from our telecom company, right? At that time, it was Verizon. We went out and bought $100 tablets that we got $100 rebates on, by the way.
Nice.
We activated them with Bluetooth technology and had the drivers all have Bluetooth. So we bought Bluetooth for $30 off of Amazon. We had a stem or like a mount installed in the truck. When I had my guy install it in the trucks. And so we were able to outfit 26 trucks with all this technology, with the tablet and everything that we needed, and then we had Bluetooth tracers for the trailers. And I'm going to tell you, my entire equipment cost was less than $8,000.
Wow.
So it's like and I did it 2 years after he did it.
Yeah.
So to your point, your competition is out there, and they're coming.
Yeah.
And they're going to take advantage of, if they're smart, they're going to take advantage of the technology that's available today, not what you bought 2 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
And if Moore's Law continues to stay at the rate that it's at, which is what technology doubles every 18 months, the reality is what they're coming out today. I mean, we saw this in the wireless industry. A new phone would be launched, and 3 months later, the phone was outdated.
Yes. Yep. Pretty much.
Yeah. So I mean, it's and so anything that's tech based is going to have that exposure. And so if you don't continue to innovate, you're going to get left behind. You're going to get burned.
Yeah.
The other quick story I was going to say, you remember our friend Lloyd?
I do.
Yes, and he built he had that whole software program for that learning development.
Yes.
For
Yep.
For language learning.
Yes.
And he missed the boat.
Yep.
You paid all the money to have the technology built. What they should have built, they should have built Zoom.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
That's basically what they had. They had Zoom.
Yeah.
And fast forward 14 years later or something like that.
Yeah.
That's basically what they built. They just built it, and didn't realize the application.
Yeah. No, and it's Yeah, in a challenging market, which we're in, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. Is you have to think about problems differently. Look at your people in your business. Look at the industry you're in, and look at where are there other opportunities that I could use the resources, the personnel, the skills, the capital. Where else could I use that I could be benefiting, that I could be planning for the future, that I could getting incremental opportunities that I can't get today. And that's really where, a coach and a consultant can help guide you, because we see those other perspectives and those other opportunities. So,
Well, yeah, and I think the thing I'd add to that is, like, for instance, I may not know exactly what's out there, but I know enough of what's out there to know that if we just ask the right questions of the right people,
yeah,
we're going to find the best solutions.
right. Yep.
Right. And then so oftentimes, to your point, that small business owner that we talked about that's on the island, they don't know what's out there because they're not looking at it, because they're so focused on their day to day.
Yeah. We're just trying to survive, right? Hey, I can't even think about something new because I'm just trying to survive and pay the bills, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I actually add one more story. My wife works for a very prominent title company, national title company. They're one of the major underwriters. And right now, with the real estate industry the way that it is, they're feeling the pinch, and they had some layoffs and they did some cutbacks. But I will tell you that I'm gonna make a prediction in the title industry. There's going to be a huge shakeup in the next 5 years, and it's going to play out in the real estate industry as a whole. Title is going to be one of those ones that really feels the pinch, because there's a lot of legacy, long-term, long-standing companies that have been doing the same way for too long, and they have not adapted technology, and they've come kicking and screaming, and they don't want the technology, and they're not adapting, and they're going to get beat by the younger, more aggressive, and I say younger thinking, more aggressive, more tech savvy, and they're going to beat them to the punch, and you're going to see another industry of all these massive, just like retail, massive long-term companies, 100 years in business, they're going to fall by the wayside. Real estate's going to be the next one that feels the pinch. The title is going to be those.
Is it going to be AI, Eric? AI come in and do all the title searches? And
I mean, why would I need to have somebody sit and do all that research when I can have a computer do it in minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's important to always think different. How do we get lean? How do we think strategically? These are all things that we coach. And on that note, Eric, I think we've had a good conversation today. I'd be curious, where can folks learn more about you and your coaching business?
Yes. So please go to myBizCoaches.com. Look a little bit about what we do. Feel free to schedule a consultation if you got some questions. Be more than happy to show you how we might be able to help improve your business.
Awesome. Love it. And to learn more about TLG Group, which is Train Lead Grow, head over to trainleadgrow.com or at TrainLeadGrow on your favorite social media site. And make sure that you follow and subscribe to this show so you don't miss other important episodes. We'll be talking about more topics like this and a whole lot more guests, interviews, and we've got some exciting stuff planned for upcoming episodes. So you don't want to miss out. Be sure to follow and subscribe. Until then, have an awesome day, and thanks for listening to the Biz Coach Show.
Great. Thanks, David.